A 73-year-old man leaves his beach cabin to a homeless woman, but when she entered the house, she got a big surprise. John, a 73-year-old man, had lived alone in a cabin by the beach ever since his wife, Elizabeth, passed away. His hair was white like sea foam, and his eyes, though still kind, held a quiet sadness. The cabin, with the smell of old wood and seashells scattered in the garden, was more than just a house. Every corner carried a piece of Elizabeth, as if she were still there in small memories. "I still see you around, my dear," he would say to himself, sitting on the old rocking chair on the porch watching the sun. "I hear you in the waves, in the wind. You're still with me, aren't you?" Even after all those years, the silence in the house was always filled with memories. The sound of wind chimes, which Elizabeth loved, tinkled softly in the breeze. John would close his eyes and smile slightly, imagining her laughter whenever the wind played that little melody. But John's children didn't see the cabin with the same affection. One day during a visit, his eldest son Samuel brought up the topic John always avoided. "Dad, we need to talk. Don't you think it's time to sell the cabin?" Samuel asked, trying to be careful but direct. "Sell it?" John raised his eyebrows and set down the newspaper he had been reading. "And what would I do without it?" The younger son, Gabriel, sighed, already tired of their father's refusals. "You could move into a care home. You'd have company and be looked after. It'd be easier for everyone." John shook his head, his eyes welling up with tears he tried to hide. "You don't understand. This house is all I have left of your mother. We lived here, laughed, cried, and made plans here. Leaving would feel like leaving her behind." "Dad," Samuel started, but John raised his hand, asking him to stop. "No, I'm staying. As long as I have the strength, I'll be here. This house isn't just a place. It's my living memory of Elizabeth." John's sons, Samuel and Gabriel, couldn't understand why their father clung so tightly to that old cabin. To them, it was just an expense and a burden. Every time they visited, the conversation went the same way. They wanted him to move to a care home where he'd be looked after. "Dad, it's the best thing for you," Samuel insisted. "In the care home, you wouldn't be alone. There'd always be nurses around." John, sitting at the edge of the sofa, crossed his arms, his expression firm. "I don't want nurses around. I'm fine here." Gabriel huffed impatiently. "Dad, you can't keep living like this. Can't. The cabin's falling apart. And let's be honest, taking care of a house like this isn't for someone your age. I do what I can. The rest, well, I let it be." John shrugged. "Let it be?" Gabriel laughed without humor. "And what if something happens? What if you fall and no one knows?" John took a deep breath, the way he did every time he tried to stay calm. He knew his sons meant well, but they couldn't grasp what that place meant to him. "You think this house is just wood," John said, lowering his voice but staying firm. "But this is where I lived with your mother. Every Christmas, every birthday happened here. This is where she—" He paused, holding back his emotions. "This is where she said goodbye." Samuel and Gabriel exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. "The care home has its benefits, Dad," Samuel said gently. "You wouldn't have to be alone anymore." But John simply shook his head. "I'd rather be alone here with her memories than surrounded by strangers without anything of what we shared." Gabriel sighed, exasperated. "And the cabin, Dad. What'll happen to it? It'll just sit here, empty. It's too valuable to be left like this." John looked at them with a mix of sadness and stubbornness. "To you, it might just be a piece of property worth money. But to me, it's the place where Elizabeth and I lived everything we had to live. As long as I can breathe, no one's selling this cabin." The sons stayed silent. They'd tried everything, but they knew their father was as stubborn as a rock. "You may not understand now, and that's okay. But one day, maybe you'll see what this house means to me." John stood up slowly and walked to the window, looking out at the sea. "Until that day comes, I'm staying. And that's that." Samuel and Gabriel exchanged tired looks. They knew it would be impossible to convince him to leave the cabin as long as he had the strength to stay. One sunny afternoon, John went out to pick up a few things from the small grocery store in town. He pushed his cart slowly, feeling the weight of age in his knees. Each step was harder than the last, but he didn't like asking for help. Proud as he was, he insisted on doing everything himself. As he left the store, carrying 2 full bags, the sea breeze blew hard, and one of the bags slipped from his hand, scattering fruit and groceries across the pavement. He sighed, bending down slowly, but his back protested and he almost lost his balance. "Need a hand?" a soft voice asked from behind him. John turned to see a woman who looked to be in her 40s. Her hair was tied back messily, and her worn-out clothes made it clear that life had been tough for her. Yet there was a kind sparkle in her brown eyes. I can manage," John muttered, proud, trying to gather the apples that had rolled onto the ground. But the woman was already crouching, smiling as she began picking up the fruit. "Don't worry, everyone needs help sometimes," she said, carefully placing the fruit back in the bag. John stood still for a moment, watching her with a hint of suspicion, but he let her continue. When she finished, she stood up and handed him the bag. "There you go. That's better now." He took it, a bit reluctantly, but grateful. "Thanks. What's your name?" he asked, looking at her more closely. "Zoe," she answered with a small, gentle smile. John held the bag with both hands and gave a slight nod. "Well, I'm John." Zoe shoved her hands into the pockets of her worn coat, looking a bit awkward. "Nice to meet you, John. I'm usually around here, so if you need help again, just let me know." John gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile, but it was genuine. "Maybe I'll do that, Zoe." For a moment they stood there in silence, with only the sound of the waves and the wind blowing softly. John noticed something different about this woman. She didn't look at him with pity the way others did. There was only kindness and simplicity. "Well, thanks again," John said, adjusting the bags in his arms. Zoe took a step back and gave a small wave. "Take care, yeah? See you around." John watched her for a moment as she walked away, slowly, like someone who had nowhere to go but was in no hurry either. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a tiny spark of something he had almost forgotten: comfort. As days went by, John and Zoe started meeting more often. Every time he went out to buy something or just take a walk along the beach, there she was, always with a calm smile on her face. Little by little, her help became part of his routine. "John, let me carry that for you," Zoe would say, taking the bags from his hands with a natural ease that he couldn't refuse. "You don't need to, girl. I can manage," he'd reply, though deep down he enjoyed her unexpected company. She would chuckle softly and without another word accompany him back to the cabin. Bit by bit, John's life became less lonely. Zoe started showing up almost every day. Sometimes she'd help with simple chores, like sweeping the porch or watering the plants in the small garden that Elizabeth had loved. Other times, she'd just sit with John on the porch facing the sea, chatting about anything and everything. "This cabin is lovely, you know. It feels so peaceful here," Zoe remarked once as she watched the waves crash on the shore. John smiled, adjusting the old blanket over his legs. Elizabeth chose every little detail. She loved this place. "That must be why it still feels so alive," Zoe said softly. Over time, Zoe began doing small things John could no longer manage, like tidying the kitchen or taking out the rubbish. But more than that, she brought lightness to his days. She asked questions, listened to his stories, and most of all, made him laugh, something he hadn't done since Elizabeth passed away. "Did you know I once tried to catch a fish bigger than I could carry?" John said one afternoon, recalling an old adventure. "Did you manage to?" Zoe asked, curious. "Almost, but I ended up in the water along with the fish," he said, laughing so hard that tears rolled down his cheeks. Zoe burst out laughing too, and the sound filled the cabin in a way John hadn't felt in a long time. With her around, the house felt less empty. John's days were no longer so long and silent. He began waking up with the expectation that, at any moment, he'd hear Zoe calling from outside. "John, have you had breakfast yet?" she'd shout from the porch, tapping gently on the door. "Not yet, come in, girl," he'd reply, feeling his heart grow lighter. And so their friendship grew, simple and natural. Zoe wasn't just someone who helped with chores. She brought back something John had lost: the warmth of companionship, the joy of having someone close. As months went by, John began looking at Zoe differently, not with suspicion, as he had at the start, but with genuine affection. He noticed that beyond helping with little tasks, she cared for the cabin as if it were her own. Every time she swept the porch or watered the plants, she did it with care, like someone who truly valued what she had in her hands. You know, Zoe, I've never seen anyone treat this house with such care since Elizabeth left, John said one morning as they sipped coffee on the porch. Zoe shrugged with a simple smile. I think it's because this place feels alive, like it still holds a lot of stories. And I like being here. John fell silent for a moment, gazing at the sea. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "That's exactly what I think too." Each day, the idea grew clearer in his mind. Zoe was the right person to take care of the cabin when he was no longer around. She understood the place's value, not as mere property, but as a home full of memories. One afternoon, as Zoe folded some towels he had washed, John finally shared the decision he had been mulling over for days. "Zoe, I've been thinking," he began, his voice calm but firm. She looked at him curiously. "Thinking about what, John?" He took a deep breath and adjusted his glasses. "When I'm gone, I want this cabin to be yours." Zoe stopped what she was doing, staring at John in surprise. "What? What do you mean?" "Exactly what I said," he replied with a light smile. "There's no point leaving this house to my children. To them it's just a pile of old wood. But you understand what this place means." Zoe shook her head, still in disbelief. "But John, me? You don't have to do that. I mean, I don't—" He raised his hand slowly, asking her to let him finish. "Yes, I do." He paused, looking her straight in the eye. "You've brought life back to this house, and you took care of me without expecting anything in return. I don't know if I've ever thanked you, but I want you to know that to me, you're already a part of this cabin." She swallowed hard, trying to hold back her emotions. I just did what anyone would do, John." He let out a small chuckle. "Not everyone would, Zoe, and that's why I want this house to be yours. When I'm not here anymore, you'll take care of it. I know you will." Zoe stayed silent for a moment, her gaze lost in the waves outside. That unexpected offer was more than just a gift. It was a gesture of trust and friendship she never thought she'd find. "Thank you, John. I don't even know what to say." "You don't need to say anything, girl," he replied, his eyes shining. "Just promise me you'll look after this place the way it deserves." Zoe gently squeezed his hand. "I promise." On a late afternoon, John called his two sons for a talk. They were all sitting in the cabin's living room, with the sound of waves crashing in the background. He knew it wouldn't be an easy conversation, but he was determined. "Samuel, Gabriel, I want to talk to you about the future of this house," John began calmly. The two exchanged quick glances. "It was about time we had this talk, Dad," Samuel said, adjusting his glasses. "Of course we can help sell the cabin. We'll find a good buyer." John raised his hand, signaling his son to stop. "It's not about that. The cabin isn't going to be sold." Gabriel frowned. "What do you mean? Are you planning to stay here forever or something?" John took a deep breath, carefully choosing his words. "I've decided to leave this cabin to Zoe." Silence filled the room. For a moment, the boys sat still as if they hadn't understood. "Zoe?" Samuel asked in disbelief. "The homeless woman? Dad, is this a joke?" "It's not a joke," John replied firmly. "She looked after me when I needed it most. And more importantly, she understands the value of this place." Gabriel let out a short, nervous laugh. "You're saying you're going to leave the cabin, our cabin, to a stranger? That makes no sense." John stayed calm, but his voice carried the weight of a man who had already made up his mind. "It makes sense to me." Samuel stood up, frustrated. "Dad, you're not thinking straight. This house is worth a fortune. We could sell it and split the money, but instead you want to give it all to this woman." John slowly stood as well, leaning on his cane. "Listen, all you see in this cabin is something to sell. But to me it's much more than that. It's my home. It was your mother's home, and Zoe is the only person who understands that." Gabriel threw his hands in the air, exasperated. "Dad, this is crazy. We just want what's best for you. Why don't you make things easier and let us handle it?" John pressed his lips together for a moment, trying to keep his patience. "I've made my decision. Zoe will take care of this cabin, and that's how it's going to be." Samuel crossed his arms, shaking his head in disbelief. This is a waste. The real waste would be giving this house to people who don't care about it, John said, looking at both of them with determination. The son stayed quiet for a few moments, struggling to accept a decision they couldn't understand. Gabriel, still upset, grabbed his coat. We're going to talk about this again, Dad. You can't do this to our family. John gave a tired half-smile. The conversation is over, Gabriel. Without another word, Samuel and Gabriel left, leaving John alone in the cabin. He knew his sons were angry, but he also knew he'd made the right choice. He looked out of the window at the sea, the waves gently brushing the shore, and felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Elizabeth, I know you'd approve, he whispered to himself, a small smile on his face. The following days were filled with phone calls and visits from his sons, each trying in their own way to make John change his mind. Dad, you need to think this through, Samuel insisted over the phone, his voice tense. We don't want to fight with you, but this is unfair. This house is part of the family. John held the phone patiently, but his tone left no room for argument. I've told you, Samuel, the cabin stays with Zoe. She looked after me when you weren't here, and I know she'll care for this place the same way your mother would have. On the other end of the line, Samuel sighed in frustration. Dad, we're not just talking about feelings. This is about money. Don't you see how it makes no sense to leave it to her? John closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. What doesn't make sense is selling this house as if it's just a pile of wood. Later, Gabriel showed up at the cabin, still hoping to change his father's mind. Dad, we're not trying to hurt you. We just want you to be safe. It's hard to see you so stuck on this idea. John shrugged, unmoved. It's hard for you to understand, I know, but it doesn't matter. Zoe is the only one who sees this house as a home. Gabriel rubbed his hands over his face, frustrated. Dad, this is madness, a stranger. You barely know this woman. John tapped his cane lightly on the floor as if to end the discussion once and for all. I know her well enough. I know her heart, and that's all that matters. Gabriel threw his hands in the air, defeated. So what are we supposed to do with all of this? John looked him straight in the eyes, serious. You learn to respect it. Elizabeth would have wanted it this way. I know she would approve of my decision, even if you don't understand. Gabriel stayed silent for a few seconds, trying to absorb his father's words. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh and shrugged. Fine, but don't say we didn't warn you. John watched quietly as Gabriel left. Once the door closed, he returned to his rocking chair, the sound of the sea keeping him company. He knew he had done the right thing. On a morning that seemed just like any other, he was sitting in his rocking chair listening to the sound of the waves when Samuel and Gabriel arrived by car. Dad, we need to talk, Samuel said seriously, while Gabriel entered the house without even asking for permission. What's going on? John asked, already sensing that something was off. We've sorted everything out. Today you're going to the care home, Gabriel said bluntly, as if the decision was already made. John gripped his cane tightly. What do you mean? You can't do this. Samuel took a step closer, trying to sound calm. Dad, it's for your own good. We don't want you staying here alone. I didn't ask for this, John shot back, his voice trembling, not just with anger but with hurt. Gabriel was already opening cupboards, grabbing clothes and stuffing them into a suitcase. There's no discussion, Dad. We've talked about this many times. We can't wait any longer. John stood up, his body heavy with exhaustion and frustration. And Zoe, I haven't even told her. Samuel sighed, impatient. We'll explain to her later, Dad. Right now you need to come with us. No, I'm not going, John insisted, his voice cracking. But they didn't listen. Samuel took John by the arm and Gabriel picked up the suitcase. Please, at least let me tell Zoe, John begged as they led him to the car. This is for the best, Dad. We'll sort that out later, Samuel said, trying to stay in control of the situation. John looked out the car window as the cabin faded into the distance, his heart heavy. He couldn't believe they were taking him away without the chance to say goodbye. Zoe had no idea, and that hurt him more than words could express. As the car sped along the road, John closed his eyes, feeling a pain deeper than any physical ache. It was as if they were tearing away the last piece of his life that still made sense. Zoe found out about John's departure from a neighbor who ran into her near the grocery store. "For they took John this morning," the man said, adjusting his cap. "His sons came and put him in a care home. Poor guy didn't even get the chance to say goodbye." Zoe's heart sank. "Do you know where they took him?" she asked, worried. "Yes, it's that care home along the road to the city." Without thinking twice, Zoe grabbed her things and set off on foot. It was a long walk, but she didn't care. She needed to see John. He couldn't be left thinking he was alone. By the time she arrived, the sun was already low, and a cold wind blew through the trees. Zoe went straight to the reception desk. "Good evening, I'm here to see John Spencer," she said, out of breath. The woman behind the desk looked at her with mild surprise but checked the name on the list. "Room 23, on the second floor." Zoe thanked her and hurried upstairs. When she opened the door to the room, there he was, sitting in an armchair by the window, staring outside with a tired face and a distant gaze. "John," she called softly. He turned his head slowly, and when he saw Zoe, his eyes lit up, though sadness soon followed. "I didn't want to leave without saying goodbye, girl," he said quietly. "They brought me here so fast I couldn't tell you." Zoe moved closer and held his hand firmly. "I know, John. I found out and came as quickly as I could. I'm here now." John sighed with relief, though he still looked weary. "I thought I'd never see you again. I thought they'd taken me away from everything." She knelt by the armchair and looked him in the eyes, serious. "John, I'll never leave you. Not now, not ever. I promise." He squeezed her hand, feeling a comfort no beautiful place could give. "Thank you, Zoe. You're all I have left." She smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "And you're everything to me, you stubborn old man." They stayed there for a while in silence, simply taking in each other's presence. In that moment, John knew that no matter where life took him, Zoe would always be by his side. On a quiet morning, with the soft sound of leaves rustling outside, Zoe returned to the care home to visit John. She brought some biscuits and hot tea, which he loved. As she entered the room, she found him sitting in his usual armchair, his gaze lost in the window. "I brought you some tea, John," she said, pulling up a chair to sit beside him. John gave a faint smile and held the cup with his trembling hands. "Thank you, girl. You always know what I need." They sat in silence for a while, just listening to the wind outside. Then John cleared his throat and looked at Zoe with a serious expression. "I need to tell you something important." Zoe set her cup on the table and focused on him, a little worried. "What is it, John?" He took a deep breath, as if gathering strength to say what he had to. "I've been sorting out the papers to make sure the cabin will be yours when I go." For a moment, Zoe was stunned. "John, you didn't have to do that." He held her hand, his fingers cold but steady. "I do. That house was the most special place of my life, and you're the only one who understands its worth. I can't let the boys sell it off like it's nothing." Zoe lowered her eyes, trying to hold back her emotions. "John, I'm not doing this for any kind of reward. I just wanted to be here for you." He smiled, his face tired but peaceful. "I know, Zoe. That's exactly why you're the right person to keep it." She squeezed his hand gently, her heart full of both gratitude and sorrow. "I promise to take care of the cabin, John, as if it will always be yours and Elizabeth's." He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. "Thank you, girl. That's all I needed to hear." A few days after that conversation, without anyone expecting it, John passed away quietly, just the way he would have wanted. It was a cold, silent morning. The nurse entered the room to check on him, but she found John lying in bed, a serene expression on his face. His eyes were closed, and his hands rested on his chest, as if he had just drifted off to sleep. Zoe was called as soon as they found out. When she arrived, she paused for a moment at the door, her heart heavy. He looked so peaceful that it almost felt wrong to cry. She walked over slowly, sat on the edge of the bed, and held his hand for the last time. "You went off like a stubborn old man. Didn't even say goodbye," she whispered, a sad smile on her lips. She stayed there for a long while, just looking at him, remembering every conversation, every laugh, and every simple moment they had shared. The tears came without her realizing, rolling down her cheeks as she held John's cold hand. "I promise, John. The cabin will be in good hands. I'll take care of it, just like you wanted." She wiped the tears away with the back of her hand, but she felt no anger, just a soft sadness, mixed with gratitude for having been part of his life in his final months. At last, she kissed John's forehead, saying goodbye to someone who had become so much more than a friend. "Rest in peace, you stubborn old man." In the days that followed, Zoe felt John's absence as a deep ache. Even knowing he had passed peacefully, the emptiness he left behind felt too big to fill. She cried alone by the sea, staring at the waves he had loved so much, the cold breeze brushing her face as if she were waiting to hear his voice again. "You're gone, John, but I'm still here," she murmured into the wind, her eyes full of tears. The pain was real and hard to bear, but she knew she couldn't give in to it. John had trusted her, and Zoe was someone who kept her word. Every day she got up with a clear purpose, to take care of the cabin and honor the promise she had made to him. When Zoe finally moved back to the cabin for good, everything felt quieter than before. She entered slowly, as if expecting to find John sitting in the armchair or listening to the wind chime on the porch. But the only sound that greeted her was the soft crashing of the waves outside. After walking through the house, her eyes landed on something on the coffee table. It was the key to the safe under the bed. There was also an envelope carefully folded, with her name written in John's shaky handwriting. Beside it, a supermarket bag full of notes tied with an old rubber band. She sat on the sofa, holding the envelope, her heart racing. Carefully, she opened the letter and began to read. "Dear Zoe, if you're reading this, then I've already gone. But I hope you somehow know that I'm at peace. I want to thank you for everything you did for me. You gave me more than company. You gave me back the joy of living, even when I thought that wasn't possible anymore. Every conversation, every laugh on the porch, every simple day by your side was a gift I never expected to receive. I'm leaving this money for you because I want to make sure you won't lack anything. Use it to take care of the cabin. And please, take care of yourself too. The cabin is yours now, Zoe, just the way I always wanted. And don't forget, life, like the sea, keeps moving forward. Sometimes the waves bring sadness, but other times they bring beautiful things we never expected. With all my love, John." Zoe pressed the letter against her chest, tears streaming freely down her face. She felt as if he were right there, speaking directly to her. John's absence was heavy, but his words brought her a bit of comfort. She looked at the money and ran her hand over it, but what truly mattered to her wasn't the amount. It was the trust, the affection, and the love he had placed in that final message. "I won't let you down, John, I promise," she whispered, wiping her eyes and carefully tucking the letter away as if it were a treasure. And in that moment, Zoe knew that even though he was gone, John would always be with her, in every corner of the cabin and in every wave that broke on the shore. Zoe reread the letter, letting every word from John echo in her heart. He had been clear. The money he left wasn't just an inheritance, but a request, a final wish filled with care and concern. "Use this money to take care of the cabin, and please, take care of yourself too," he had written. She ran her fingers along the edges of the letter, feeling the weight of that responsibility. It wasn't just about fixing the house or keeping the garden tidy. It was about keeping John and Elizabeth's memory alive. Every corner of that cabin held a story, and now all those stories were in her hands. "You always thought of everything, didn't you, John? Even when you weren't here," she murmured with a sad smile on her lips. She looked at the money, and for the first time in a long while, she felt a mixture of hope and purpose. That money didn't mean luxury or an easy life. To Zoe, it was a chance to do something meaningful, to honor John's trust and ensure that this home remained a place filled with love and care. "I'll take care of the cabin, John, just the way you wanted," she whispered, as if he could hear her. "And I'll take care of myself too. Don't worry." Zoe carefully folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside her bed where it would always be within reach. She knew there would be hard times, but those words would give her the strength to carry on. John had left not just a house and some money, but a mission. With a deep breath, she looked out the window at the sea. The wind blew softly, making the wind chimes on the porch tinkle gently. Zoe smiled, feeling as if it was a reply from John. "I'll do it right, my friend. You can rest in peace. I promised you, John, and I won't let you down." Zoe wiped the dusty surfaces, placed the plants in the sunlight, and opened all the windows to let the fresh air in. Every corner of the cabin held a memory, and she treated the place with the same care that John and Elizabeth would have. Even with a heavy heart, there was comfort in being there, as if John was still somehow close by. At the end of each day, she would sit on the old rocking chair on the porch, looking out at the sea and quietly talking to John. "No matter what happens, I'll take care of this place. I know you and Elizabeth are still here in some way, and I'll keep that alive." Zoe was tired but determined. The sadness was deep, but the love and gratitude she felt for John were even greater. In the days that followed, Zoe threw herself into taking care of the cabin. It wasn't a renovation to change everything, but to give the place a fresh life without erasing the history John and Elizabeth had left there. Every detail was thought out carefully, as if she could talk to them while she worked. "Let's make these windows shine, shall we, Elizabeth? John loved looking at the sea from here," she murmured to herself while cleaning the glass until it sparkled in the sunlight. The walls were painted soft colors, but nothing that took away the house's old charm. Zoe kept the furniture Elizabeth had lovingly chosen, just restoring it to stay sturdy for many more years. John's armchair, the one by the window, stayed exactly where it had always been, as if he could sit there at any moment. "This is yours, John, and no one's going to change that," she said, running her hand over the wood of the chair with a smile full of longing. The garden also got special attention. Zoe planted new flowers, but kept the ones Elizabeth had grown. "We've got some company now, Elizabeth," she said while watering the plants. "And I'll take good care of them, don't worry." She also repaired the roof, fixed the loose boards on the porch, and replaced the curtains with new ones. Simple, just like the ones Elizabeth would have liked. The goal wasn't to transform the cabin, but to keep it alive just as it had always been. A welcoming place where the warmth of good memories could be felt. When she finished, Zoe sat in the rocking chair on the porch, looking out at the sea. The chimes Elizabeth had hung swayed gently in the breeze, filling the air with their familiar sound. "I think you two would like what I've done," she whispered, gazing at the horizon. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Zoe closed her eyes for a moment, letting the wind brush her face. The cabin, now renewed, wasn't just a house. It was a home, filled with love, memories, and gratitude. "Everything's all right now, John. Everything's the way you and Elizabeth deserved." A few weeks later, Zoe received news that made her heart freeze. Samuel and Gabriel, still unhappy with their father's decision, decided to act. Since John hadn't had time to finalize his will before passing, the cabin still legally belonged to his sons. Wasting no time, they put the house up for sale for $150,000. Zoe found out when a real estate agent showed up at her door one day, asking if she knew when she'd be vacating the property. "Vacate," she repeated, unable to believe what she was hearing. "The previous owner's sons have put the cabin up for sale. I'm here to do the evaluation and start the process," the man explained, looking around the cabin as if it were just numbers and square footage. Zoe's blood boiled, but she took a deep breath. "This house was promised to me by John. I've got nowhere else to go." The agent shrugged as if it wasn't his problem. "I'm sorry, Mum, but without official paperwork, the cabin belongs to them." After he left, Zoe sat in the rocking chair, her heart heavy. She knew John had wanted the cabin to be hers, but without the will, there was nothing stopping it from being sold. "I can't let this happen, John," she murmured, her chest tightening with anxiety. The days that followed were tough. She saw the listing for the sale everywhere, on the internet, on real estate flyers, and even in the local newspaper. That cabin, which had meant so much to John, was now just another property for sale. His son seemed to care about nothing but the money. When Zoe was starting to lose hope, an unexpected surprise changed everything. A tall man wearing a simple suit and with a friendly face knocked on the cabin door. "You're Zoe, right?" he asked, holding a folder under his arm. "Yes, who are you?" she replied, suspicious. "My name is Daniel. I was a friend of John's. I'm a lawyer and I handled some matters for him before he passed away." Zoe frowned, still not understanding the reason for his visit. "And why are you here?" Daniel gave a small smile and stepped a little closer. "John wanted to transfer the cabin to you, but sadly he passed before we could finish the paperwork. However, he asked me to leave a letter for you in the safe under the bed and to take out a bit of the money for expenses, leaving the rest for you. He left enough money to settle the cabin, and I used it to solve everything." "What do you mean?" she asked, surprised. "I bought the cabin for $135,000. I even added some of my own money to make the deal work, using what John left for you along with mine," Daniel explained. "The cabin is yours now, Zoe. No one can take it from you." It took a few seconds for his words to make sense in her mind. You bought the cabin? And now it's mine?" Daniel gave a soft smile. "Exactly. John wanted you to have this place, and now it's all sorted." Zoe covered her mouth with her hands, tears welling in her eyes. It was hard to believe that even after his death, John was still looking out for her. "I don't even know how to thank you, but you used your own money too," she murmured, her voice shaky. "There's no need to thank me. It was the least I could do for my old friend," Daniel replied. "Just take care of this place the way John would have wanted." Zoe wiped her tears and looked around the cabin, feeling a wave of relief and gratitude wash over her. "I will. For him, and for Elizabeth." Daniel gave her a small wave goodbye and left, leaving Zoe alone in the cabin that was now officially hers. She slowly closed the door and sat in the rocking chair, gazing out at the sea with a soft smile. "We did it, John. This house will stay just the way you dreamed." Zoe stayed there for a while, letting the silence fill the space. But this time it was a good kind of silence, the silence of a mission accomplished. A gentle breeze made the wind chimes on the porch tinkle, and she smiled, feeling as if it were a sign from John, letting her know that everything was as it should be. That evening she lit some candles and made a cup of tea. She sat in John's armchair and took out the letter he had left. Running her fingers over the handwritten words, she felt a deep sense of peace. No one could take the cabin from her now, and she knew exactly what she had to do. The next day, Zoe began planning how to make the cabin more than just a home for herself. "This will be more than just a house, John. It will be a place for anyone in need, just like you always wanted," she said aloud, as if speaking to him. And little by little, she put her plan into action. She prepared an extra room for anyone needing a place to stay for the night and put up a small sign at the entrance of the cabin that read, "If you need rest, this is your place." She planted more flowers in the garden and made the porch a cozy spot where anyone could sit and enjoy tea while looking out at the sea. Time passed, but Zoe never stopped caring for the cabin with the same love that John and Elizabeth would have. And just as she found comfort there, others began to find it too. A few days later, Samuel and Gabriel found out about the sale of the cabin when the estate agent informed them that it had been sold for $135,000. At first, they felt relieved to be free from the burden of maintaining the place. But that feeling didn't last long. One afternoon, Gabriel received a message that left him stunned. "Samuel," he called, holding his phone, his voice full of surprise. "What is it?" his brother asked, frowning. Gabriel held up the phone for him to read the message. It was a brief note from the lawyer who had handled the sale. "The new owner is Zoe." Samuel blinked a few times, trying to understand what it meant. "Zoe? The homeless woman? How is that possible?" Gabriel threw the phone onto the table, frustrated. "She bought the cabin. She must have used our father's money." Samuel ran a hand through his hair, struggling to process the news. "So, all that money over the years that we never knew how he was spending? It was for her, and now the house belongs to her too?" Gabriel let out an angry huff, the fury building inside him. "She planned this all along." Pretended to help Dad just to get what she wanted. Samuel shook his head slowly, still in disbelief, and we thought selling the cabin would be the end of it. The room fell silent for a moment. Samuel sat down on the sofa, looking lost. He wanted her to have the house, Gabriel. We didn't want to see it, but that was the truth. Gabriel crossed his arms, still seething. So what now, we just accept it? Samuel shrugged, defeated. What else can we do? The cabin is in her name. Gabriel closed his eyes for a moment, frustration boiling within him. This isn't what I wanted. A few days later, Samuel and Gabriel showed up at the cabin, still carrying the weight of dissatisfaction. They knocked hard on the door, and Zoe, though she knew this moment would come, opened it calmly. "We need to talk," Samuel said, crossing his arms. Zoe invited them in, keeping her voice steady. "I know why you're here." Gabriel got straight to the point. "This place was never supposed to be yours. This cabin belongs to our family." Zoe took a deep breath and walked over to the small table in the living room. She picked up the envelope containing John's letter and placed it on the table. "Before you say anything else, I want you to read this." Samuel picked up the letter and opened it. As they read John's words, their faces began to change. The frustration was still there, but now mixed with surprise and perhaps a hint of shame. When they finished reading, Samuel looked at Zoe with a more subdued expression. "So he really wanted you to have the cabin?" "Yes," Zoe replied firmly. "He trusted me and knew I'd take care of this place the way he and Elizabeth would have wanted." Gabriel, still holding the letter, shook his head in frustration. "But he didn't manage to formalize it. There's nothing official." Zoe crossed her arms and looked firmly at the two of them. "There didn't need to be a document. His wishes are clear in that letter, and you know it. You just don't want to accept it." Samuel lowered his head, pressing his lips together. "We just thought the cabin should stay in the family." Zoe took a step forward, her voice calm but full of meaning. "And it has. John and Elizabeth live on in every corner of this place. I promised him I'd look after it, and that's exactly what I'm doing." Gabriel let out a deep sigh, running a hand over his face. "This isn't what we imagined." "Maybe it's not what you wanted," Zoe said, "but it's what he wanted. And I won't let him down." Samuel and Gabriel stood there, absorbing what they had just read and heard. John's letter, filled with sincere words and affection for Zoe, was impossible to ignore. They exchanged a long look, as if they were finally beginning to understand something they had refused to see before. Samuel was the first to break the silence, his voice quieter than usual. "He really did care about you, didn't he?" Zoe took a deep breath, thinking of all the simple, special moments she had shared with John. "Yes, he gave me more than I ever expected, and I did what I could to give back." Gabriel sighed, rubbing his face like someone exhausted from resisting for too long. "I guess we never really understood what he needed. We just wanted to do what seemed easiest." "I know," Zoe said without bitterness. You wanted what was best for him in your own way, but John needed more than care. He needed someone to see him as the man he'd always been, not just an old man who needed help." Samuel closed his eyes for a moment, as if letting go of the last doubts he carried. "I think that's what he found in you." "He did," Zoe answered, with a gentle smile full of both sadness and warmth. "He found friendship. And I found it in him too." Gabriel shook his head, but this time there was no anger in his expression, only a resigned weariness. "Well, at least he left in peace, knowing you'd take care of this place." Zoe gave a soft smile, brushing her hand along the edge of John's old armchair. "And I will. Until the very end." Samuel took a step back, seeming to finally accept the situation. "I think we did the right thing by letting this go. The cabin's in good hands." Gabriel, still a bit reluctant, let out a long sigh and seemed to relax. He knew what he was doing, and I guess deep down we did too. The two of them prepared to leave, no more arguments left, only the quiet certainty that John would have approved of how things turned out. Before stepping out, Samuel made one last comment. "If you need anything, we're around." Zoe gave a sincere smile of gratitude. "Thank you." Over time, Zoe turned the cabin into much more than just a home for herself. She made it a place where anyone in need could find peace and comfort. The promise she had made to John lived on in every corner. The cabin's door was always open to anyone who needed it. Some people came looking for a hot meal, while others just wanted a place to rest and listen to the sound of the sea. Zoe greeted them with a smile and a cup of tea, just like she had done so many times with John. "You're at home here. Stay as long as you need," she would say to every person who stepped onto the porch. She planted colorful flowers in the garden, creating a space where anyone could sit and feel the soft sea breeze. What had once been just a reminder of Elizabeth now became a symbol of new beginnings for those seeking hope. On cold nights, Zoe would make warm soups and bake biscuits, remembering how much John had loved simple meals filled with meaning. "He always said it's not luxury that matters, but care," Zoe would explain to anyone who cared to listen. Word about the cabin slowly spread through the community. People began coming not only to seek help, but also to offer it. Some brought supplies, while others came just to share or listen to stories, creating a cycle of kindness and generosity. One quiet afternoon, a woman with trembling hands arrived at the cabin's door, her eyes tired and filled with sadness. "Can I stay here just for today?" she asked softly. Zoe welcomed her without hesitation. "Stay as long as you need." And so the cabin remained a place of rest, just as John had imagined. The porch was always filled with stories, laughter, and peaceful silence. The wind kept ringing the chimes, a gentle reminder of John and Elizabeth. Every night Zoe gazed out at the sea, feeling a deep sense of peace for having made the cabin more than a home for herself. It had become a refuge for everyone. "You would both be proud," she whispered to John and Elizabeth as the sun dipped below the horizon. And so the cabin stayed a home, a place of love, care, and new stories, just as John had always wanted. This story shows us that the true value of things isn't found in money, but in memories, relationships, and the love we share. John understood that what really matters is leaving behind a legacy of care and kindness. Zoe, with her generous heart, teaches us that small acts can change lives, and the greatest wealth lies in making a difference for others. And what about you? If you were in John's children's place, would you have honored his wish from the start? Or if you were in Zoe's shoes, would you have had the same courage to fight for something promised with so much care? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. We'd love to hear what you think. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell to receive alerts for new videos like this. Every week we bring emotional stories that touch the heart and make us reflect on life. Oh, and there's a special video waiting for you right now. Click on it and continue with us on this journey filled with lessons and emotions.